Hello students, this is Mrs. Foy and this is a screencast on blood. This is part 3 of the cardiovascular lecture that I'm giving my students in anatomy and physiology class. If you are watching this screencast, you're probably in my class, and if so, you are opening up the Google presentation and following along as you watch the screencast. If you are not in my class and you would like access to this Google presentation, please contact me and I will gladly share it with you. So guys, we're going to talk today about blood. And blood is actually an example of liquid tissue. It is a type of connective tissue that has a liquid matrix. And there are some solid cells in this liquid matrix. And the cells are red blood cells and white blood cells, and then some blood fragments called platelets. And then in the plasma is actually what we call the liquid matrix, the liquid background material of the tissue. And in this plasma, which is predominantly water, we have digested food material, so we have glucose and amino acids in there. We have some waste, such as urea, which is a waste product that is produced when proteins are broken down, and that urea is sent to mostly be made into urine. We have hormones, which are chemical messengers that are circulating in our blood. And we also have two gases. We have oxygen that is being delivered by our red blood cells, and we have carbon dioxide that is also carried a little bit by our red blood cells, but mostly is dissolved in the plasma. So here I can tell that I am looking at some kind of vein in the lower body, because I can see that in this blood vessel I have a valve here, and I know that blood valves in the veins are keeping blood from flowing backwards. So I know the blood is flowing this way because these valves here are keeping the blood. If the blood tried to flow back this way, then those valves would shut. So I know that this is blood, and I know it's in a vein. I know it's in the body, lower body going forward. And I can recognize that there are 3 types of blood here. So I see my red blood cells. These are also called erythrocytes, or RBCs for short. I see my white blood cells, which are also called leukocytes. These are part of my immune system. And then platelets, which are blood fragments. And then my plasma is my liquid kind of background material, where some of those materials are dissolved. So guys, we used to do this this lab in my room. If you used to take just a very sharp little lancet and you were to prick your finger and draw just a little drop of blood, so here's my little drop of blood, and then if you took a very tiny skinny tube, almost like a straw, called a capillary tube, and you just set it right on top of the drop of blood, then what would happen is the blood would actually be sucked up in that tube. And then if you took that tube and you put a little stopper of, like, say, clay or something on the bottom of it, and then you put that tube and you put it in a centrifuge. A centrifuge is an instrument that spins very fast and can separate materials based on centrifugal force. What would happen is that you would see that in the bottom part of our tube, if this was our tube here, this is actually a test tube, but it would look the same thing if it was a capillary tube, you would see the bottom part would be red. And those are the red blood cells. They're the heaviest portion of the blood, and they go to the bottom. And then you would see a very thin little layer called the buffy coat. This would be the white blood cells and platelet layer, and you can see there's not nearly as much of them as there are red blood cells. And then the top layer would be this straw-colored liquid that is the plasma. And the plasma is going to be, like I said, the matrix that carries the solid cells, and these materials are dissolved in the plasma. So we have carbon dioxide, we have glucose, we have amino acids, proteins, minerals like iron, We have vitamins, we have hormones that are chemical messengers, and we have waste products like urea that are eventually going to be transported to the kidneys and excreted as urine. So remember when we were doing our histology unit and you were looking at different types of tissue, one of the connective tissues that you looked at was blood. And you will recognize this from looking under the microscope. So all of these maroon things that you see, those are all red blood cells. And red blood cells are actually, if you looked at them from the side, they are a biconcave disc that is very skinny in the center. And so if you were actually to look at this through a microscope, sometimes the light comes through and it looks like there's a hole there like a donut. It's actually not, but that is the skinny part. There's no nucleus, and the nucleus is actually lost in development. And so these red blood cells have a shelf life. They don't live very long. They get pretty beat up, but they're recycled. They are recycled in our liver. And so that's a good thing. You also see these larger cells that are our white blood cells. So our white blood cells are much larger, there's fewer of them, and they have a very darkly stained nucleus. And then finally you see these little tiny purple things, and these are the platelets. And these are going to be responsible for, platelets, sorry. These are responsible for our blood clotting. So here's a great picture of a red blood cell, much better than the one that I just drew. You can see it as a biconcave disc. It has no nucleus. And inside this cell, there is a protein called hemoglobin. And hemoglobin's job is to carry or transport oxygen. And that's what hemoglobin does. It actually bonds to the oxygen and it transports the oxygen to the cells that need it. And of course, cells need oxygen so they can make lots of ATPs. And this red blood cell is flexible and it can actually squeeze through a capillary. So a capillary is so thin that these red blood cells actually have to squeeze through single file. And they do that quite nicely. So our platelets are actually bits of larger cells that we'll see in a minute, and the job of these is to produce a blood clot. That is their job. We're going to talk a little bit more about those in just a minute, but when there is some kind of injury to our tissue, such as we see here, that starts some chemical signals that attract these platelets to go to the site of the injury. And those platelets start a chemical cascade that produces this stuff called fibrinogen, and it turns into these fibrin fibers, and that helps to form a blood clot. And we can see the fibrin fibers right here. It looks kind of like a web, like a netting, and we'll talk more in depth about that blood clotting process in just a minute. So white blood cells, there are many different types of white blood cells. As I said, they are very easily distinguishable because they have a large nucleus. There are two main types. There are white blood cells that turn into macrophages, which eat and digest bad guys, pathogens in our blood, and lymphocytes, which end up making some types of proteins called antibodies, which kind of are going to handcuff the foreign proteins. And we also make some other types of lymphocytes that fight viruses and infected cells. And so some lymphocytes produce these antibodies. Antibodies, you can think of them as kind of protein handcuffs that help to stop and isolate foreign invaders. And then these other types of lymphocytes which produce some chemicals that actually break down poisons and actually end up destroying some foreign cells or viruses that get into our cells. So if you take another advanced class, then you will have to learn everything on this diagram. But for my purposes, I just want to show you that this is an example of what we would call a stem cell. So you know that stem cells can differentiate into many different types of cells. That's what makes them so powerful and so valuable. This particular type of stem cell, though, is called a hemopoietic stem cell, and these stem cells can only divide into certain types of blood cells. And so I just wanted to show you that here. So some types of these stem cells end up producing these big cells called megakaryocytes, which end up producing thrombocytes. Thrombocytes is another name for platelets. And we see some other types of these stem cells produce our red blood cells. Some produce these cells called mast cells, which are types of white blood cells that are involved in a lot of times infection, but also in allergies. And then we have these types of cells that differentiate into these different types of leukocytes that help fight invaders. This particular type can turn into a macrophage, which is like a little Pac-Man that eats foreign invaders. This type of stem cell turns into natural killer cells. These are going to supposed to kill our cancer cells and cells that have been infected with viruses. And then we have T lymphocytes and B lymphocytes. These are going to be matured in the thymus. These are going to end up killing cells that have been invaded by a virus. And our B lymphocytes, which end up producing cells called plasma cells, and these plasma cells produce the antibodies, which are the chemical handcuffs that help to subdue foreign invaders so the macrophages can eat those pathogens. So if you are following along with the video, with the Google presentation, that there is a video here that I'd like you to watch about blood clotting. But I'm going to go ahead and summarize the 4 parts of this as you're watching here. So the first thing that's going to happen that we're going to see is that when you get some type of tear or injury to our blood vessels, the body responds so that you don't continue to bleed out of those. And the first thing that happens is that there is a chemical call for help that calls the platelets. And the platelets come and they clump together and they form a temporary plug. It's not a very strong plug, but it's a temporary kind of a Band-Aid that helps protect the blood from escaping from the blood vessel. The next thing that happens is that platelet plug in turn activates these clotting factors, which are proteins that are circulating in the blood. And those kind of act together with the platelet plug to kind of reinforce the platelet plug, make it a little stronger. Then that clotting factors that are activate this material called fibrin, which is actually activated from another protein called fibrinogen. And this fibrin are these long stringy things that you see here, and they kind of act like glue. They're sticky and they hold the platelet plug together with these reinforced clotting factors, and they kind of pull together and make kind of a net. And that in turn catches some other types of cells, some white blood cells and red blood cells that actually end up getting caught in that net, which reinforces the blood clot. And so this blood clot is going to stay, it's going to contract a little, it's going to harden, and then as soon as the tissue underneath heals, our body helps degrade the blood clot and reabsorbs the material, and we go on as normal.